So there has been a bit of chaos down at Mar-a-Lago among Team Trump. Their words, not mine. His lawyers have put out a very short statement strenuously denying the charges. The former president himself put out a much more lengthy statement attacking Alvin Bragg, going on a long list of grievances against Alvin Bragg, and then a long list of grievances of things that have happened to him in the past. The reaction from Republicans has been fascinating, even those who are running against Donald Trump in the Republican primary, Nikki Haley. This is more about revenge than it is about justice. With that, we bring in Mick Mulvaney, acting chief of staff during the Trump administration. It's good to see you. It's been a while. I'm trying to figure out what the middle road here is. And we saw it from Ron DeSantis' his tweet. We're now seeing it from Nikki Haley. We'll see what Mike Pence says in about an hour and a half from now at his town hall. Is it this middle road of attacking Alvin Bragg, saying that this is a political prosecution, and not saying, if they can, the word Trump?
You know, is there a middle road here? Probably, and it's for the president, the former president Trump, not to try and incite a riot. I think he's got public opinion on his side right now. Even his critics like myself are defending him. His opponents, Nikki Haley, defending him. It's sort of hard to look at the facts and the circumstances of what's going on with these hush money payments and not think that this is a political witch hunt. I mean, where do you want to start? There was a former DA before Alvin Bragg who decided under the same facts and circumstances not to charge him. The key witness seems to be Michael Cohen, who's been in jail for lying to banks and lying to Congress, probably one of the least credible people in the country when it comes to Donald Trump. There's a long litany of reasons that this case probably should not have been brought. So the president could win that argument by saying less. Of course, he's not really capable of doing that, but at least he would come out and not sort of encourage violent protests. I think he could do really, really well politically under these facts and circumstances.
Well, to be fair, so far, he has not. He's not called for any kind of protest or rally or anything else. His lawyers have said basically he's innocent. He said he's innocent. And the closest he got to politicking in his statement was talking about how he's going to win. And then he's going to throw all of these people out of office that have done this to him. I keep coming back to this image of Trump Force One, the 757, sitting on the tarmac at Palm Beach. This is the same plane that he took from New York 2 days after the election and then landed in D.C. and headed to the White House to meet with then President Obama. He was president-elect. It's hard to sort of overstate the symbolism of that, and likely this will be the same plane that he flies up to New York to answer these charges in. You know Donald Trump very well. You know his playbook very well. He's never better than when he is fighting against someone and can act in some way as an aggrieved victim. Is that not true?
Oh, sure. Listen, he's in the office right now at Mar-a-Lago trying to figure out how to make this into something that's good for Donald Trump. I think May was right. Your previous guest said he's not happy about being indicted. He's not happy about what that does to his name, his reputation, his legacy. He doesn't want to be the first president ever to be criminally charged, but that will pass in minutes, if not hours, and he'll then move on to, okay, how can I make this work for me? Keep in mind, he's a master showman. You can expect that when he does go to New York, and I understand now he is going to New York, or has agreed to go to New York to be booked, that he's going to turn that into some type of spectacle that works to his advantage. And you should be able to, you expect to see that throughout this entire process. I mean, imagine at the end of all this, if he's tried in front of a jury and the jury comes back and says not guilty, which is essentially what the jury said on the similar charges to John Edwards 20 years ago. That's going to be a huge political boon for him if he handles it properly. And Donald Trump knows how to handle these sorts of situations properly when it comes to handling the politics.
I got 30 seconds, and I'm a big fan of the idea that when smart people do things that you don't understand or don't make sense, there's something you don't understand. Alvin Bragg, Harvard-educated attorney. He's not an idiot, and he's not an idiot politically. Is there a chance that we're not accounting for an ace up his sleeve?
Two possibilities. Number one, he has a piece of information that we don't know about. And of course, the indictment has not been unsealed. The other possibility is that he's a really, really smart guy but is also a politician and promised that he would indict President Trump when he ran for office, is delivering on this and might be expecting to turn this into re-election to this position or maybe to higher office. So yeah, there's a couple of things that could explain this other than Alvin Bragg is just a dummy, because I don't think he is either. But unless it's new information that we don't know about, this is going to reflect very badly on him, I think, in the court of public opinion outside of Democrat primary voters in New York.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the red button to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.